Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. Let's be real. Living a human existence is hard sometimes. There's so much that's out of our control as we navigate things like loss, death, divorces, harmful political ideologies and policies, conflict, and war, to name a few. And this episode isn't about trying to gloss over or avoid any of that. But this episode is about resilience and ways to transform the pains of life into a sense of purpose that fuels your way forward. My guest this episode is motivational speaker, resilience advocate, and author of Unbroken, Turning Pain into Purpose, Juan Espinoza. From a broken parental relationship in childhood, through the combat trauma he experienced during his military service in Afghanistan, to the challenges of a marriage marked by betrayal and infidelity ending in divorce, Juan has learned that no matter how deep the pain is, there is always a way to rise, heal, and thrive. And through his book, he hopes to help others do the same. So let's welcome him into the New Masculine to hear his story and hopefully learn ways to develop resilience in the face of adversity. Thanks for joining me, Juan.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't really top that intro, so fantastic.
That's great to hear. I mean, I did get to read the book ahead of time, so I get a little sense of who you actually are and some of the journey you've been on. So I'm glad that I was able to really grab ideas about who you really are and what you've been through.
Awesome. I think that's the big thing is when you show everybody the good and the bad, that's who you truly are. I think that's a fantastic idea, and I think people should lean on that.
I'm so with you, and it's still a thing I keep learning as a person that's a coach and often working with people and helping them better their lives. Sometimes it feels hard to show the bad or the ugly or the struggle of my life. I always just want to package it up and make it look nice all the time, but I'm really working on as a person how to let myself be a whole human in the world, not just a professional identity, not just somebody with some skill sets, but to actually be somebody who has to navigate this challenging life just like everybody else does.
I think that's a big challenging part of just life in general, right? You want to show this persona of just like you're this awesome human being, but also there's that part where it's not so great. You don't want to share that. And I think that's, it's a difficult process to do, but I think when you do it, it's very empowering, just not just with yourself, but also others as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's what we'll get into is like, by you doing that through this book, by us doing that in this conversation, we give permission for other people to do the same thing, to free themselves to be whole people. So thank you for just up front for writing a book that gives other men permission to really explore all parts of their life and not just present the good stuff.
Exactly. I appreciate that. I appreciate that the good knowledge that you shared. And I think that's the big thing. I'm not an author. I just did it. So, I think that's just being who you are as an individual. I think that's an empowering thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I've alluded to some things in that intro about some of the pain points of your life, but I also want to just hear about what your journey has been like as a guy in this world. So take me back to your sort of childhood and what you learned about growing up as a boy and what you sort of learned you needed to be as a man in order to be successful.
So I think the big thing was for me, I can't really say I had an awful childhood because I really didn't. I had my dad that loved me, I had my mom, which is my stepmom, that loved me as well. So I think that's a big thing. It's really, I can't say my childhood wasn't awful. You know, a lot of people can, say like, well, and my childhood was bad. That's why I became this way, but I can't really say that. Like granted, my biological mom was in the picture, but my stepmom basically took up the plate and showed me what a mom is supposed to be.
Mm.
So I think that's a big thing. It's really when we have these bonds through family, it's not through blood, it's through connections and relationship, right? Through effort. So I think that's a big thing. When I was growing up as a child, I was always like that wild kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jump off my grandma's house, my one-story house, or I would, you know, do like the daredevil type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's who I was. But being as a man, I watched my dad, right? My dad's always working. He was always busy. And through those tough times, you can see like in their eyes, through people's eyes, you can tell like something's going on.
Mm.
My dad was like, he worked himself to the bone. So that to me as a man, that's what you have to do, right? You have to put your family first. You have to do what's needed to make sure they're okay. That you might not have the answers all figured out, but at least you're trying and you're putting that effort to show that you're committed to the family.
Mm. When was that something you could see as a kid, or was that something you now look back on as an adult to see that what was going on behind your dad's eyes during that time?
So as a kid, my dad was just dad,
Uh-huh.
right? That's just like what he did. I didn't really get looked too much on that.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, I was just like, okay, that's dad. That's like, dad doing, dad stuff. But now as an adult, I'm just like, wow, like he was actually like doing a lot,
Yeah.
right? He was putting his effort. He was trying. So I think that's a reflection of being a kid as well as being an adult to actually see the whole picture.
Yeah, I think it's so common for all of us as kids to not notice the humanity of our parents, what they're going through, the struggles they're facing, the amount of stress they're holding at different times, because we're the kid. We don't have that ability to really put ourselves in someone else's shoes. But as we get older, I think that is some of the biggest work that many of us do, which is to recognize that the people that raised us were also figuring it out as they were going and carrying their own burdens and doing the best they could in many situations, even if sometimes they failed. And being able to look back on them with like compassion and empathy is a really powerful way to connect with our parents.
Definitely. I think it's a big part of just self-reflection, right? Not just with yourself, but also just like, okay, like growing up, like what did you see now as an adult with you have more experience and you understand that world? You see things from like a whole different picture. And I think that's a very vital sign of just growing, right?
Yeah. Going back to that concept that there's like the good and the bad in all of us, or in all of our experiences. You mentioned that your biological mom wasn't really in the picture, but you did have a stepmom that is your mom, that basically stepped into that role and showed you what a mom is. What's the good and the bad within that? Like if both are true at the same time, what are the good and bad that of your childhood growing up like that?
So a big thing is with family, everybody tends to think that, blood is everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your biological mom, your biological dad, your sisters, brothers, whatever the case is. You would think that's like, that conquers all. But reality, it's the people that step in that don't have to be there, right? It's like my stepmom married my dad. She didn't really have to like treat me as her own.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it. Like, you don't have to. You're there for that, that person, but at the same time, they have kids. So what I saw was a woman that stepped into a position where she knew that her spouse had additional kids. Instead of making them feel like they were not hers, she basically embraced us as her own. And that's the good. The bad is like, okay, well, you didn't have your biological mom, right? Your biological mom was there. The person that gave birth to you, the person that carried you for 9 months wasn't theirs. But why?
Mm.
Right. And that was the big thing that I had no idea that I carried that burden for so many years. I would think that, okay, well, was I not like good enough? Was I not like a good son? Like, did she not care enough for me?
Mm-hmm.
And the both aspects, I realized, the good is that I had my stepmom, which she's my mom. She's fantastic. But in my biological mom, the same thing. It's like, well, she gave birth to me. I'm here. I'm here because of her. Can give that. But at the same time, the bad is, well, she wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can understand where the primary thing that leaves you with is a lot of questions, one of them being why, one of the big ones. And then I think it's interesting how common it is for children whose parents are not in their life, whether it's the mom or the dad, is to sometimes go through a phase at least of blaming themselves. Was I not good enough? Looking at your own sort of self as the problem rather than the choices that the adult in the situation made. I can see where that might be tough to work through throughout your lifetime.
Definitely. I think that's the big thing is, as everybody wants to know why, right? There's always that motivating factor that we all think about. And as kids, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves that maybe, if I would have done this better or that better, but in reality, that's not our choice.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
We're just in this situation and we're just going, we're going with the wind at that point. So living life as it is. So I think the big thing, it's just don't put too much pressure on yourself. Like,
Yeah.
you didn't make those choices.
Yeah. How have you come to resolve that motivating question, that sort of the why question, as you've gotten older?
So I think that comes to a big thing is just realizing that I didn't have any control.
Yeah.
I was a kid. I was just doing what kids do. I was just going through the motions, but I realized when I got older, it's like that had nothing to do with me.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't because of what I did. Maybe it might have been like something that between, them, but that has nothing to do with me. So I just letting go of that fact that it wasn't me. I think that's a big thing of how I was able to resolve that question.
Yeah. That's big work to do. Hard for a kid to recognize that it's not you, and to like really believe that and to really own that so that you can move forward, to accept it and to move forward with that knowledge in mind. Did you have any help in doing that, or was that something that you were able to come to on your own?
With that, I was just over the years I grasped that.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, when I wrote my book and actually look about everything, that happened in my life, like I faced that pain directly, and that's why I realized, okay, well, that's not me.
Yeah.
That's their choice. I can't control that.
It's so crazy how many times I hear this from authors, that they go to write a book that's all about like the transformation they've already been through, and yet the process of writing it continues the transformation and continues the healing process, because you get to see it all out in front of you. You get to project it out onto the page, and you get to see all of the nuances over time and see the bigger picture rather than just the like acute feelings in the moment. You get to actually see a broader view of it all, and that has a healing element to it as well.
I think that's an important thing that where I always tell people, write it down,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you see it from a third person's perspective. Okay, you write it down like, this is how I felt. This is, what happened, whatever the case is. But then you're also reading it. So you're from that third person perspective where you see, okay, the evidence on one side, the evidence on the other side, and you're actually able to analyze that from like, not yourself, so to speak. So I think that was a big part for me, is just like, okay, well, like you didn't control anything. That wasn't you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautiful. I'm glad that you got that experience. I'm glad the book helped you take the healing even deeper for yourself. You mentioned that, so those are some of the like kind of lessons you got from your relationship with your mom and the healing journey you've been on that in that situation. But you also mentioned with your dad that you picked up a sense of like the provider archetype and working really hard for your family. Tell me how that's played out in your own life as a man, having watched that with your own dad?
So I think a big thing with just watching my dad and like in silence, right? You watch you can gauge people just based on their actions, right? What they do like a normal day to day, not just like a one-time occurrence. And I've always watched my dad. He's always busy. He's always working. He's always doing something. And that has shown me that it's about effort. It's about trying.
Mm.
It's not about results, right? Yeah, you would like results. Like results are awesome, but put in the effort to try. That's better than doing nothing at all and just, standing on the sidelines, so to speak. So I think I seen that in him. And I think that when I was growing up and now I realized that as long as you try and put effort, that's what matters.
I think I see that so much in your actual book, the like sort of self-compassion for yourself, the acceptance of the work that you're doing throughout and what certain relationships taught you is your current, like the work you still need to do. You still have this compassion and sort of like willingness to see your goodness in your trying and the effort you're putting into it rather than the results going exactly the way you wanted it to. And I think that's such a beautiful lesson that not all of us as guys get. Many of us learn that the results are the most important thing and do anything to get to the right result. But what you're offering is there's a different way of seeing it. That's the process, the effort, the trying. That's really the value spot. And the results sometimes are out of our control, as you've experienced throughout your life.
I think that's a very important factor when you realize like a big part of my book that's basically changed my life entirely was perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? The way you see things, has changed the way I view things, right? And even when it comes to pain to purpose, right, or it comes to healing, or it comes to relationships, it's all about perspective. And I think that's a big thing that with men in general, that everybody's results oriented.
Mm.
Like you have to make six figures, you have to have a house, you got to have a car, a fancy car, but they're not saying, all these successful people, what did they do to get there?
Mm-hmm.
They worked, they put effort, and they tried.
Mm. Beautiful. How did the culture of your family and your community, how did that shape your ideas of what you needed to be as a man?
So that's interesting. So I grew up in a very Hispanic culture. So we don't show emotions. We don't cry, right? We're very this like, a man's man type of culture.
Machismo.
Exactly, machismo type culture. And I think that's where I saw it, but I also saw the flaw, right? So I think that where you go to, the 1950s, 60s era where it's like, a man works and he works construction and he comes home and the wife takes care of the kids and, that's her job. And when he comes home, she has to make sure food's made and he's taken care of. But reality, it's not just a one-sided situation. A big part of me realizing, what I failed on was providing financially, but also not providing emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that emotional part of growing up in the culture I grew up in, is we didn't offer that. Like, you can't be weak.
Mm-hmm.
That's, you can't cry. That's a sign of weakness. You can't. But when I realized that now it's a whole perspective of just not just one part, but also the other, the financial, but also the emotional part.
Mm-hmm. How did you come to realize that you were putting all of your focus and energy on providing financially and for a life, but not actually providing emotionally for your family?
I think a big part of that was just looking at the situation entirely, not just from my point of view, but my spouse's point of view. Like, what are they saying, right? They're seeing this guy that goes to work, he works days in, days out, but when I need to talk to him about emotional stuff, like he's just so tired, he can't provide that.
Mm-hmm.
And getting that third person perspective, just to look at the situation from a third party, you can see the whole picture. You don't just see one side part, shot a one-sided picture. You see the whole thing. And I think that's a more of a self-reflection thing that we need to do as just men in general, or just a society in general.
I would imagine that your time in the military also plays a role in sort of that emotional intelligence, that ability to like sit with your emotions and express emotions. Tell me about how that plays a role.
Well, that's something else, tell you. So I was in the military. I joined when I was 18, straight out of high school. I deployed my first deployment in 2010. I was 18. In Afghanistan, the war, it was just like, it was raging. It was the Wild West in Afghanistan at that point. I didn't know what I was getting into. So just going in there, you're go through basic training, you go through some trainings just to get there, but you're just thrown in a world that you have no idea about. Like, yeah, war is like you expected to go. But I think for me, I didn't realize how fast I would go. Right. It was a shock factor for me. And the time in the military, I realized that resilience is not always just so aggressive, right? It's the fact that you can take these hits and still be standing, right? You can go through all this amount of trauma, amount of loss, and still be standing. And that's where I realized that resilience is not how much hits you can take, but also how you still be on your feet at the end of the day and not lose yourself.
That's such a mature and evolved perspective that I bet it's pretty hard fought. Like you've had to win that over time. I bet in the middle of it, taking on those traumas didn't quite feel like that.
Easily. I think anybody with trauma, really just think about it. Like you're always worried about like, why me? Like, what did I do? I'm a good person. But when you look at it from that different perspective, like I mentioned earlier, when you change your perspective, you start to see the lessons that it's giving you. Any type of loss, you're just like wondering why. And the why factor is, it's ingrained in all of us. We always want to know, like, what's the motivating factor? What's the, trying to think of the whole, like, 48 or after 48, they talk about like, what's the motivating factor of why they did this, this. But when you look at that from like an outside perspective and don't see it from how you see it, that's when you actually see like the lessons it's giving you. It's not always bad.
Yeah, such an important skill to practice these days is being able to see things from other perspectives. There's so little of that happening in our current dialogue and culture. But I love how you're pointing to the lessons that can be learned when you see it through someone else's perspective, not just through your own eyes.
Definitely. I think, so the question I would ask you is a big event in your life, whether it's a loss, it's a trauma. Have you ever looked at it from a different perspective? And if you did, what did you see?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been some of my growth as a man for sure. Like I can see where younger versions of myself that would go through really hard experiences, became kind of like self-focused in the way that I approached my viewpoint on it. And I felt either victimized by it or wronged by the situation without really taking into the complexities of the situation. And I think some of my work as a man has really been to go back to those experiences to unwrap and look at like, okay, well, what's my part in that? I can't be the person that's right and like completely right in every situation that's been hard for me. I play a role in those. Relationships are two ways. There's like, I influence the situation. And so like being able to go back and really take a honest look at how I contribute to certain situations or conflict in relationships has been a big part of my work. And, I can see some places where I was pretty invested in being right in a situation to the point where relationships ruptured and I could no longer maintain them. And yet, if I had been able to do what you're talking about, I think there could have been a place where we could have stayed connected. Those relationships wouldn't have had to rupture if I was able to take the time to see it through their perspective as well.
When you mentioned that, it's definitely the whole perspective change when you, it could be difficult, right? Because we don't want to be wrong.
The ego does not like that.
Right? We don't want to be wrong. Like I'm
No.
right all the time, but when you change that, it shows you the light of everything entirely.
Are there any example stories you can come up with from your time in Afghanistan or in the military that were at the time felt like the why me, why is this happening to me, but you've been able to do that work to reflect on other perspectives to see how it's built resilience in you?
So, well, Afghanistan entirely, like a big thing was its loss, right? The brothers that you serve with, the people that you've known their families, between, what they tell you. A big part of me was this, I've always seen it as like, this guy's had way more going up for him than I did. Like, how did he not make it, but I did?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big, I guess you call survivor's guilt. But I think I realized that what I learned was just the beauty of life, right? To embrace people as who they are, no matter their background or whatever the case, their preference is, it doesn't matter. Just embrace life as it is. It's beautiful when you actually see it from a perspective of just beauty and giving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would imagine it's not always easy to feel that way when you're in the midst of those challenging experiences, when you're losing brothers around you, when you're being shot at, when you're going through like really scary experiences. I'm sure it's not easy to get to that place while you're in the moment of it, but I love knowing that you didn't stay in the trauma. You've been able to evolve your perspective out of it so that you can learn more acceptance, more compassion for other people, more like willingness to see the complexities of people and like and embrace them rather than reject them.
For me, that's the biggest part of growth, is just changing my perspective and really, life's not fair. That's how it is. No matter how you want it to be as fair as you want, you can be the greatest person in the world. It's not fair. But when you see that all the trauma that you go through, there's a lesson to be learned if you're willing to learn it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing. It's just, like losing brothers, over there, you're in a very intense situation where you're just trying to just protect them. And then when you can't, you feel like you failed. Or when you do a mission and you would take a life, then you feel like, okay, well, I'm not really doing God's work, because thou shalt not kill. Well, I just did that. But reality is, when you're trying to protect yourself and you protect your brothers and you're trying to experience this trauma, when you look at it from a learning perspective, you can learn a lot about yourself and just life in general.
I'm impressed by your ability to do that work, because having had people in my life that have been in war, have been part of military service, I don't see them able to unpack that some of the times. Like I see them still operating in that. You talk in the book around like that, how difficult the transition was between like military service and back into civilian life, and what are the rules now once you've been through these traumatic experiences, once you've taken a life, once you've had people die around you, how do you transition back to regular civilian life? And I think I see a lot of guys struggle with that. I see a lot of men who have been in the military unmoored from a sense of purpose or direction, because that transition can be so hard and there's not that many things out there giving the skills to make that transition.
A big part of that was just changing my perspective. I think that's a big part of that. Is when you're ingrained in this military culture, you're just very just like structured. You're just like, you have a purpose. That's like what you do. But I think a big part of just not being so hard on yourself. Like you had to do like things that you didn't want to do. You had to experience things that no one could possibly imagine, the worst that human beings have to offer. But if you look at it from an outside perspective, from that point of view, you've seen the worst that humans have to offer.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can see the beauty that humans have to offer. Life as it is, right? We're very grateful to where we're at. And just to look at life in general, like I'm still standing, I'm still here experiencing life as it is. Just don't be too hard on yourself. It's okay to hurt, but the big part of transitioning from military to out of that mindset, you have to address that hard truth. You have to address the pain that you don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to address pain? No one, because it hurts.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But once you address it, you grow and you realize, okay, well, like, wow, like I've been through a lot and I'm still here.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're talking about is a lesson that I need to keep hearing throughout my life. It's like I know it and then I forget it, and then I know it and I forget it. The whole like seeing life as it is rather than the story we've created up in our mind of how it should have been. Accepting life as it is, recognizing that life isn't always fair in terms of the sense of fairness that I have in my mind, that learning to accept life as it is where true freedom comes from. Because I always say one of my favorite games is to argue with reality and say it shouldn't be this way or it didn't have to go that way. It's just like, but when you can accept life as it is, then that's where you actually have more freedom and power to change your experience of it.
Exactly. I think that's the big thing is, that very like stoic philosophy where it's like, focus on what you can control, not what you can't, right? If you can control it, control it. If you can't, don't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big thing. It's we live in a world sometimes in our heads where we want it to go this direction. I'm extremely guilty on that. Like I wanted to do this, go this direction and it didn't. And then I just like questioned myself, like, am I worthy? But when you realize that life's very unpredictable, if you just embrace it entirely, you'll find that purpose, find that meaning and just see that beauty in life in general.
Yeah, one of those unpredictable things from your life. I'd love to hear if there's anything you'd like to share, like your time in the military and then coming back and then redeploying, but in a private sector kind of way. Had an impact on your family, had an impact on your marriage and your sense of your parenting and stuff. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
So that's an interesting factor. So when you look at, I was so ingrained overseas, like it felt like home, right? That constant chaos. Like I felt like I can focus, like this is my home. Like I can go to Afghanistan tomorrow and be fine. Not a problem. I know that environment, but like coming home to be a father is just so second nature to me. Right. And I think that's it's a hard truth to swallow, but when I had the opportunity to deploy as a private contractor, I jumped on it. I was like, oh, I can make a lot of money and I could go to this place I've been familiar with for so many years. Hell yeah. But that's where I neglected my marriage at that point, where it's that whole paying the bills versus the emotional connection. I neglected that emotional connection. I can definitely see that. Like just think, from an outside perspective, if you have a spouse that's been gone for so long, eventually you get lonely, right? You miss that emotional connection. And I failed. I definitely felt on that, and that took a lot for me to swallow that. As a good husband and father, I thought I was neglecting parts of me that I never offered. So when I basically deployed, I would always communicate with family and communicate with, my ex-wife and my daughter, just calls whenever I can. And when I came back and realized, that was gone, right? It was that sense of connection was gone. I felt it. I just couldn't grasp what it was. Maybe it was a adjustment issue. So when I came back, I was thinking maybe just trying to adjust from being over there to be back, back in that family provider role. But that emotional connection was gone. And after the fact that, in my book, I tell where, that connection was gone. My ex-wife started doing things that she didn't really, she tried to justify that maybe it was just I'm being crazy. So I started thinking that like, oh, maybe I'm crazy. Like, I've been gone for so long. I'm just trying to adjust. And I found out that she got pregnant soon after I returned, you know, saying I was the father, and I was excited. Like, which father wouldn't be excited? And eventually it got worse, where she was in labor and I was in the training exercise back at home. And she called me. She's like, I'm in labor. I'm going to the hospital. And I was like, okay, I'm on the way. And she was upset. It was a feeling of just like, don't come. And that for me, that was like shocking. I'm like, I'm, I'm the father, I'm the dad. Like, why wouldn't I go? That's crazy. After the fact, I found out, the baby wasn't mine. I filed for divorce, and I found out she had an affair while I was overseas. It was a hard truth to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily know why she did what she did, but the fact that I played a role in that, I was at home, and that's definitely a hard truth to swallow. But I realized that as good as I thought I was doing, there was also consequences for that good.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you being willing to share that story. It kind of ties back to when you asked me a question about when I've looked through other people's perspectives, what I could see from their perspective. That is such a hard thing to do, to go through something that feels like betrayal, something that feels like you were wronged in that situation, but to look at your own part in it. That's exactly the thing I'm talking about. And that is confrontational to our ego, to our sense of self. It is really hard to look at our own parts of it. And it does sort of create a whole sense of the picture rather than just one side of the picture, which is the betrayal you felt from those experiences.
I think that's an important factor is when you look at pain from an outside perspective, it's hard. It's not easy, right? You did everything right. And when you talk about your, maybe your past experiences, like I was doing everything that I was supposed to, but it still went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at what were you doing, right? What did you do wrong? Maybe because you didn't know or you're naive at the time. Whatever the case is, it's a hard truth to bear.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't want to see that.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like the benefit of doing that helps you in the future to know how to do it better next time, how to be in relationship more wholly the next time you're in a relationship. But what have you done with the pain or the betrayal or the hurt or the anger that came from the part of it that you experienced?
So with my my marriage and divorce, I think the big thing that I realized that it's not just a one-way street.
Yeah.
It's a two-way street. My brother-in-law always says it takes two to tango.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important factors where it's not just you, it's them as well, right? You could play your part, but also they got to play theirs. And I think a big thing for me is I realized that the power of forgiveness between that situation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very important factor a lot of people don't see, but I think it's a very important when you realize that forgiveness is not about them. It's about you. About forgiving yourself for maybe not knowing what's going on or maybe not paying attention. I learned the power of forgiveness through that.
That's beautiful. You talk about the lessons of loss in your book and forgiveness being one of them, but you also talk about authenticity mattering and resilience is key. Is there anything else you would say about those other lessons that you received from losses like this?
I think a big thing with this is you have to be authentic to your core. Just be who you are, the good and the bad. With my marriage, a lot of the times I was trying to fit into a mold that I thought like what a husband or a father should be, right? But at the same part, I wasn't embracing the bad time, the bad stuff too, right? But I think the big thing is if you're going to be authentic to yourself, You have to embrace the good and the bad, right? You know, that's a big thing where people don't realize that being authentic is just being yourself. When I say it like that, it sounds pretty easy. In reality, it's not, right? You know, like I have a huge smile, but I might be the skinniest guy in the room. That might be bad for some people, but just embracing that, like, it's okay. Um, with that, you know, with resilience, I mentioned it Warpath in my book, and it sounds very aggressive and military, in an aspect, but it has nothing to do with that. It's basically what it means. It's being on a warpath is basically committing to a cause with everything you have. Like, failure is not an option. And I think that's a big thing what people don't do. They, you know, in relationships nowadays, it's very honeymoon phase, I guess you would say, right? You go to that honeymoon phase, it's fantastic. I know this person, it's amazing. But when it starts to get rough, yeah, I'm gonna bail. I'm gonna go somebody else. I'm gonna do the honeymoon phase again.
Mm-hmm.
But what people don't realize, it's when you go through those tough phases, that tough time, and as long as you both are both in it, you can create like a 50-year marriage just from that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where resilience comes into factor. It's like you just got to go through you know, the storm, you know, to get to the sunshine, so to speak.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up this concept of warpath, because it was something I wanted to ask you about after having read the book. Because I'm grateful that you point out that it sounds like it's really aggressive, and I found myself both like really resonating with this concept and also like going, oh, this is like using the language of war in this is like, I feel uncomfortable with it also. And so I love that you're bringing this up. And I think, you know, the way that I connect to it right now is I see a lot of people really struggling right now, in our current sort of political, cultural change and shift that's going on in the world right now. And regardless of your own belief systems, I do see people really activated and angry and feeling like their values aren't represented, or they're not getting their piece of the pie, or like there's just a lot of stuff going on right now. And I think for some reason the language of warpath really resonated with me, because to deny people's activation and anger and hurt and fear and all that stuff and just try to create some glossy, nice version of our way through this is sort of doesn't seem like it really meets the moment. And so I'm really curious about this language of warpath, because of the mixed response I had to it while reading about it.
That's a very interesting question. So with when I mentioned the warpath, I had a family member was like, warpath, that sounds very aggressive. I was like, no, I know it sounds aggressive. I have a military background. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But like, read the chapter, then let me know after.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when you go to war, you fight for your cause.
Mm-hmm.
You fight it out. That's what war is, right? And I think the fact that when you see it as a no-fail option, that's where basically I mentioned make it or take it. That's just how it is. And, you know, because if no one's going to fight for your cause, who is? You fight for what you believe in more than anybody else can. You know, I think that's a big thing with, you know, the culture now. We're very, you know, divided. You get the left, you get the right, you got, you know, your agenda. But if you're respectful and actually fight for what you believe in and put all your effort into that, like, it's very fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you could be a warpath with your family. I want to be the best father,
Mm-hmm.
husband, or wife, or, you know, daughter. Doesn't matter. And you're putting that effort. And I think a big part of that is just putting the effort, putting the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I appreciate you giving those other examples, because they add the nuance to it that makes it make sense. Like, you can be on a warpath to be the best father. You can be on a warpath to create the business that has a high impact on people's lives, that benefits lots of people, that there's just more nuance to it. And I don't know, like, in some way, I kind of like the conflict that shows up in me around this word, because of it makes me feel something. It makes me feel both resonance and a little like resistant to it. And I think when I can sit with both of those feelings being true at the same time, I think there's something in there for me to really connect to. And I think that my invitation to other people is to be able to sit with complex emotions like that, like feeling resonance and wanting to reject something all at the same time, and see why they both exist within you. See what's in there for you, because maybe there's something for you to gain from sitting with that for a little longer.
I think that's very important. So my question for you, why do you think you have resistance to, I guess, that verbiage or just the concept in general?
I think I tend towards more of a pacifist approach. I think that so much of what I talk about here in the New Masculine is about the male tendency, that what we've been patterned to do, which is to just go after things, conquer them, to achieve a goal. And sometimes we miss out on paying attention to the impact we have on others when we're really going for it like that. And so I think the resistance comes from like this almost sometimes plays into that a little bit. Like, be so singularly focused on your warpath towards something that there might be others left in your wake. That's my fear, I think, because there may be others left in our wake, and we're not doing the sort of empathy and understanding that we belong within things, that we belong in community. We're not just an individual that we need to chart ahead on. But I also feel really activated in the moment. I feel really determined in my life to create a beautiful life, even though things are scary out there, that things are really tough in many situations and uncertain. So it's hard for me because it both plays on something that I feel like my work is around helping to unravel a little bit, but it also is where I find myself energetically right now, is a little determined.
I think that's good. It's really, we have to be determined, right? We have to have goals. And we have to reach for the goal, shoot for the stars, sort of concept. And I think the big thing for me, like a warpath, like I'm committed. I'm going here. Like, if I got family, I'm swooping you up. You're coming with me. This is, but we're going together. And I think that's a big thing. It's really, you have to have those goals. And I think that determination comes into play with the warpath, where, we just can't be stagnant. And, if we're going to take our community with us, we're all on a warpath. Let's go. So I think that's a beautiful thing when you look at that concept.
Is there any part of you that has any resistance to the language? Like, I know you come from, like, you've been in war, you like that, this is kind of your language, but especially if you consider like the trajectory of our country, like in some ways things are getting more and more violent as we continue to like be in this conflict, in this division that's happening. Is there any part of you that has concerns around using the language of war to describe this sense of determination when we've already seen places where things get violent and out of control in our culture?
Honestly, no. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that if you're going to fight for your cause, there's going to be some type of aggression. There's going to be some type of, not necessarily violence. It could be respectful violence, right? Debating. That's a respectful violence. This is my point of view. This is your point of view. Let's debate it out. That's somewhat aggression, right? Versus like, not saying anything in general. Like, I think the path we're on now is with the, you got the left versus the right, right? Immigration is a huge thing right now. So, I'll bring that up. You got the right's very just like, deport everybody, like the left's like, no. But if you're able to go to war together and actually debate these things and find out like, okay, well, I like what you're saying on this aspect, but not on this aspect. And be like, okay, well, I like what you're saying on that aspect and I agree with you, but not in this aspect. We're talking. I think that's a big thing, is we got to talk.
That's really clarifying, because to me, the connotation behind warpath is that we're not talking. We're just so determined that we're going to barrel through and fight for our cause. But it is really clarifying to hear that listening to others, see back to what you've been learning as a human, is a part of this, seeing things from other people's perspectives to get the whole picture, not just our own. I think that's really clarifying to hear you talk about it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, is, a lot of people get that misconception where like, war is just like this so like aggressive, when the warpath, war's aggressive, it's violent. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, you just fight for your cause. You can always be respectful and actually like listen to see maybe you don't have to fire shots. You can actually resolve this just by talking.
Yeah. Something that really stuck out to me, and I don't know whether or not you've looked at this in your life, but it's just something that stuck out to me while I was reading your book, and I wanted to see how it sat with you, that so much, at least how you presented it here, so much of your learning has come from your relationships with women, whether it's your birth mother, your stepmom, your ex-wife, your daughter, the next relationship you were in with Lola. There's so much like feminine presence in your life in how you grow and how you evolve as a person. Have you noticed that or paid attention to that in your life?
Definitely. Right. That's been like a lot of the causes, right? So think about the Trojan War, right? The War of Troy is fought over a woman. Adam and Eve probably came down to a woman, right? So if you think about that concept, I think it's a very important factor. I'm the only brother with sisters. Majority of my
grew up in a female-dominated house too.
Exactly. So majority of my nephew and nieces are all nieces. I have one nephew. So I think that's a big thing. It's just I'm able to see the factor on both sides as like growing up with a very predominant female presence, but also have that male presence. So like, hey, I'm going to war. I've done all this, but also relationships as well. I've learned to, after pain, I've learned to see it from an outside perspective. I think that's a very crucial role. You have to see not just one side, you have to see both to gain the whole picture.
Yeah, and I think that's such a valuable skill set to have, to be able to put ourselves in someone else's perspective. And I think one of the biggest differences we can have sometimes in life is the difference between the female experience versus the male experience, or the experience of someone who feels confident and has power, and maybe somebody who has less power in this world, or vice versa. That there's so much benefit from being able to see from other perspectives. What would you say are the biggest lessons you've received from your relationships with the women in your life?
Empathy. That's definitely probably a majority of what I get my empathetic nature from is from the women in my experience. What it showed me is that you can actually be very passionate in that cause if you see it from that perspective, versus like the very like macho mentality or aggression and hard charging all the time. But the compassion comes from the female experiences I've had and have. I've learned to realize that it's okay to be vulnerable. And I think that's a majority of where I get that side of me was from those experiences.
Yeah, I love this sort of, now I'm seeing sort of the alchemy of this concept of like the warpath with the empathy and the vulnerability all blended in together, so that it's not just all masculine. It has some sort of like that feminine quality to it that allows for empathy, that allows for vulnerability in the process as well.
I think that's like a formula for something that can't be beat. You're not just seeing it from an aggressive standpoint, you're also seeing it from a sympathetic standpoint, from a compassionate, empathetic standpoint. I don't know how do you beat that? I don't think you can.
Yeah, I don't know if you can either, because you have the strength and solidness and the ability to fight for what you believe in, but you also have the ability to see things from others' perspectives and fight for a good cause and be a protector for the people that need protection.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. It's like, I can bury you if you harm my family, but I can have my daughter do my hair and paint my nails. Can't beat it.
Yeah. I love that. So you've written this book, Unbroken, Turning Pain into Purpose. What do you hope is the impact this book will have?
I think the biggest thing I try to do is just to show that pain is not the end. All the trauma and pain we suffer, if we shift our perspective, it's a big part of my book is just all about perspective. If we shift that perspective and actually learn what it's teaching us, we can actually grow as an individual, as a community, as a society. And I think that's a big part of why I wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
It was not just because of my journey, but also I want to embrace others to look at things from a different perspective to help progress their life. So I think that's a big part of what I want people to read or to understand when they read my book. You know, you read my book, I basically, when I'm writing my chapters, I throw questions in there like all the time because I want people to not just think it's my story, but also think about their own story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the most impactful parts of the book is you sharing your story gives a permission structure for all of us that are reading it to do that, to see somebody that's doing that work, to see somebody who's being vulnerable, see somebody who's looking at their own growth points, who's navigating tough things, but then to not get so lost in your story, you pause every once in a while to ask us a question as the reader, to let us try on some of what's playing out in your storytelling in our own life. And I think that's a really powerful way to do that, so that we both get the permission structure that your story gives, but also then now we get the chance to apply it to our own life.
I think that was a big important factor for me. It was just showing people like it's easy for people to say, open up, be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm here, right? When they don't share their story. But for me, it's just like, okay, well, here's my mistakes. Here's where I'm vulnerable. Like, what's yours? People are more gravitate towards that because it's very authentic. It's very, okay, well, he showed his bad sides. Like, I'm okay to share mine.
Yeah.
So I think that was a very important factor of my book is was just like, I don't just want to be about me. I want to be about me and you. So I think that was why I threw those questions in there.
That concept of me and you is so in alignment with what I am trying to do with this podcast, that this is about our own individual journeys as men, but it's also about our connections with each other, about our connections to the world, to our sense of belonging and community, that it's me and you. It's not just me constantly, or it's not just you. Like some of us as guys learn, I think some of my patterns can be a little bit more like codependent and enmeshed kind of patterns. And so I can make it all about you in my relationships. It can be all about the other person. How do I show up for you? What are your needs? How do I make sure that you're happy? But forget to check in with myself, forget to include the me. And so like some of us have to learn how to incorporate the you, and some of us have to come back and reincorporate ourselves into the equation too.
That's a big thing. It's when you realize growing is just, you're just taking pieces of where you can. Like, I like what this person does. I'm going to take that. I like what this person does. I'm going to take that. Male or female, doesn't matter. And I think that's part of growing, just embrace all of that and just create our own story, create our own journey and learn through those lessons.
Beautiful. Are there any other ways outside of like a podcast like this that you're sharing your message or sharing the work that you're doing in the world?
So for me, I have speaking engagements. I'm always available to speak to just the masses. Doesn't matter, male, female, doesn't matter. I speak to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Also, my website, where I have people email me and, I'll set up a Zoom call and I'm just like, hey, just talk it out. Like, or people in my area, I'll take them out. Like I had a couple weeks ago, I had a friend, old coworker of mine. She basically stated she was going through like a rough time and she was in a lot of pain. She was tired of running from it. So I just asked her, do you drink? She's like, yeah, okay, let's go get a drink because you're probably going to need it. And we talked it out and I let her just, cry her eyes out. But at the end of the day, it's really, we connected and she felt so much happier because she got that off her chest.
Wow.
So I connect through my website, connect through speaking engagements. Just anybody I can talk to, let's just talk.
Beautiful.
We all need somebody to talk to at the end of the day.
If people were curious about that and wanted to connect with you, either through hiring you to do a speaking gig or to just connect with you in the way that you're talking about, how do they find you out there in the world? What's your website?
So my website is juanespinoza.me. So that's my website. Just shoot me an email. What you want to talk about. If you want to set up a Zoom call, just let me know. If you want to speak an engagement, let me know. A lot of the causes I have is my fees are pretty low. For my one-on-ones, I don't charge anything. Like I don't care. Like for my book, I don't make any money. It's just printing costs. So I think that's a big thing, is just trying to impact as many people as I can, help as many people as I can. That's what I'm trying to do.
Wow. Impact strategy that isn't so forced into a capitalistic mindset that it becomes this whole money-making endeavor. That's pretty powerful to hear.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. It's like, you can make money. Like, sure, like we all have bills. Obviously, I got to work, and I would like to transition to this to be my full-time gig. But society is holes. We have bills to pay. So, I gotta do what I have to. But at the same time, is if I can change people's lives, that's why I do it. I'm always have this very helping personality. Doesn't matter who you are, what gender you are, what demographic you came from. I don't care. As long as I can help you, to me, it's worth it.
I really respect that about you. I really respect that you see this as about impact and about helping others rather than about the ways to get rich or the ways to make money. And you're right, there are realities to living in our culture, and that's something that I navigate with my own coaching business all the time, of like, how do I still pay my bills, but how do I be the most impactful I can be? So I really respect that in you, that you have your value systems settled in that way.
Thank you so much. I think it's a big thing. It's like, if we didn't have bills, why not? Right? But it's just reality. We have bills. We got to live.
Got to accept reality as is, as you were saying earlier.
Exactly. I think that's a big thing. So I can't say money's not an issue, because obviously it is. But if it wasn't, then that'll be a different issue.
Well, I've had such a great time talking with you, learning about your own story, talking about your book. I can't recommend people go find it and give a read to it if they're finding themselves stuck in their pain patterns and needing some support in learning how to turn that into a sense of purpose. What's the best way for people to get the book if they were looking for it?
So the best way is it's on Amazon. It's exclusive to Amazon right now.
Okay.
So just Amazon, Unbroken, Turn Pain to Purpose, my story, Juan Espinoza. That's the best way to get my book. You could go to my website. I have an Amazon link on there as well. You just click the book and it goes straight to Amazon page, and you'll be able to get it.
Great. Well, I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes so it's easy for people to find it as well. If people want to get in contact with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Travers03. That's where we get to keep this conversation going. So find me there and let's keep chatting. And if you want to support the mission of this podcast, please go to patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Thank you again, Juan, for taking the time to connect with me and for sharing your book with me. I've had such a lovely time being able to hear about your story and being able to connect with it. And just really thank you for the work that you're doing in the world.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, you're welcome.